Hi everybody. Whenever we think of domestic abuse, we tend to think in terms of physical violence. However, of all the various forms of coercive control, the most prevalent is emotional abuse, which tends to underpin every other form of abuse. Now, emotional abuse is any ongoing pattern of behavior that is non-physical, that seeks to exert power and control by undermining an individual's emotional safety and/or their psychological stability. It is characterized by what one author calls the 5 Ds: dominating, demeaning, degrading, deceiving, and dismissing. If you want to get an idea of what emotional abuse is, read the definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13 and then reverse the meaning of the words and the values recorded there. And that gives you a snapshot of what emotional abuse is. The paradox of emotional abuse is that while it is the most prevalent form of abuse, it is also the least recognized. That's partly because it represents such a wide variety of dysfunctional behaviors that prey on a victim's vulnerabilities. Sometimes overt and obvious, name-calling, ridiculing, shouting, but sometimes a lot more subtle, keeping secrets, hiding information, playing mind games. So it is not unusual for a victim of emotional abuse not to recognize their relationship as such. And if they are emotionally dependent on their abuser, it can be difficult to remove the scales from their eyes. It can also be difficult to recognize because some of the negative traits of emotionally abusive relationships can also be present in non-abusive relationships. And that's why it's important to make the distinction between what one author calls a destructive relationship and an abusive relationship. With the destructive relationship, it lacks the element of coercive control. But for victims of emotional abuse, it can be difficult to recognize if they have a distorted concept of what love is, of what love looks like, because abusers can be masters of deception. What masquerades as love can actually be the seductive manipulation of a grooming process. Now, that's the term we usually use for child abuse, but grooming is simply any behavior that's designed to increase opportunities for abuse, so adults can be groomed too. Came across a passage in the Psalms that captures the essence of grooming, where David talks about one of his enemies, and he says that his words were as smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His speech as smooth as oil, yet they were drawn swords. So the first task of an abuser is to worm their way into the affections of their targets, and then once the emotional hooks are in, it becomes a lot easier to perpetrate the abuse and much more difficult for the victim to escape. And then that abuse can go unchecked for months, years, sometimes even decades, eroding and destroying the individual's self-esteem and self-worth in the process. Again, the words of the psalmist are pertinent here, where David talks about the impact of his persecutors, and he says that I am broken by their taunts, flat on my face, reduced to nothing. So victims of emotional abuse can lose their sense of identity and become defined by their abuser's negative opinion of who they are. And the results of that are predictable. Anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, sometimes suicidal ideation. It has been shown that victims of abusive relationships are 3 times more likely to develop serious mental health issues. Add to that the chronic stress associated with abusive relationships can lead to life-threatening physical ailments like heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, strokes. So when it comes to emotional abuse, this is no minor matter. This is serious business. Emotional abuse is just as serious as physical abuse. In fact, if you speak to victims of emotional abuse, they will tell you that the emotional and psychological part is the worst. They don't necessarily come with cuts and bruises, but they come with broken hearts. They come with shattered dreams. They come sometimes with a faith that is hanging on by its fingernails. So what can we do? Well, one of the first things that we can do is to acknowledge that the problem exists, and that will go a long way to showing victims of emotional abuse that they don't have to live in an isolated world that is detached from their suffering. We can raise the profile by using the forums that we have in our churches to talk about these issues. We can help victims of emotional abuse by equipping them with the boundaries they need in order to protect themselves in those abusive relationships. We can point them to the organizations listed at the end of this video that can provide them the kind of support that we can't. And if you are watching this video and you agree with the content, then press the share button, because you never know who needs access to this information. So let's work together to get the word out there, so that we can do whatever we can to stem the tide of abuse in our churches and in our communities. And let's do that so that we can fulfill the law of Christ by bearing one another's burdens. Let's work together. God bless you.